Yes, this is what happens when you play these fucking games. When I first got my NES back in 1986, I remember playing Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt until I fell asleep with the controller in my hand and the TV on. The first games I ever played along with Mario were Excite Bike, Kung Fu, Ice Hockey, and Ghost and Goblins. I remember playing with my cousins, taking turns to try to pass the freaking first level. We never did. It's Halloween! What better time to play a spooky game? So, it's Ghouls' Ghosts
versus
Super Ghouls' Ghosts. Originally released in the arcades, Ghouls' Ghosts was a big hit, so naturally ports came, and oh my god did they come. Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, CP System, Commodore 64, Sharp X68000, Sega Saturn, PlayStation, PlayStation 2, Super Graphics, Sega Master System, Sega Genesis, CX Spectrum, and Virtual Console. I don't recall seeing that many ports of an arcade game before. 2 years after that, we got Super Ghouls' Ghosts, directly to the Super Nintendo. No arcade here, but it was ported to a lot of consoles as well. Sega Saturn, PlayStation, PlayStation 2, Xbox, Game Boy Advance, PlayStation Portable, Virtual Console, PlayStation 3, and Nintendo eShop. Of all the different ports, we're gonna compare the Sega Genesis versus the Super Nintendo. In Ghouls' Ghosts, you are King Arthur, in a quest to restore souls stolen by none other than Loki. Well, it's actually Lucifer, but for some reason they changed that in the translation. What the hell is that all about? One of the souls stolen is from Princess Prin Prin. Princess Prin Prin? Oh, fuck me. In Super Ghouls' Ghosts, Princess Prin Prin is captured by Emperor Sardius. Well, she's not captured by him, he sends someone to capture her and... you know what? Fuck it, both of them have bare-bones stories, and just because of Princess Prin Prin, I'm just deducting a point to each one of them. The Sega Genesis version is pretty close to the arcade, which is very impressive. At a close glance though, you can really spot differences, especially in the background. Some of them just don't have enough detail. I mean, look at this one, it's just black. On the other hand, some levels have very impressive parallel scrolling. It does give the game a lot of depth. And the game runs buttery smooth even with a lot of sprites and a lot of action going on at the same time. The Genesis version has some neat visual effects as well. Look at this, you can shoot at the fire. Cool. One look at the Super Nintendo version though, and we can start to see a lot of differences. It has much more detail all over the place, more and better use of colors, and there are some levels that uses Mode 7 pretty cool. Parallel scrolling is present here as well, though it's not as impressive as the Sega Genesis version. And the game suffers from a lot of frame drops during a lot of action. Even with all that, it's not hard to see that Super Ghouls' Ghosts just has better graphics. The sound is just no contest. Let's listen to the graveyard and theme music of the franchise back to back. Yep, the Super Nintendo is known to produce better sound than the Genesis, and this is just another example of it. Mind you, this is not always true. The Sega Genesis does have many examples where the music is much better than the Super Nintendo, but this is just not the case. But I do love and get mesmerized by the music in the continuous screen. Oh yeah, press start. And I also love the powering down sound that the armor makes. Talking about the sound effects, the Sega Genesis version has some really ear-bleeding sound effects. Ugh, it sounds awful. The Super Nintendo is adequate, nothing more to say about it. So I think it's pretty clear that Super Ghouls'n Ghosts has better presentation in graphics and sound compared to the Genesis version. A point awarded to the Super Nintendo. Let's start with the options. The Sega one does not fuck around. Look at this, either practice or professional. Either you barely know what you're doing, or you're a fucking pro. The SNES one is much more reasonable. But don't get me wrong, no matter which one you choose, you will die. And die, and die, 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 die. The game is notorious for being one of the hardest franchises there are, and these two do not disappoint. The Super Nintendo lets you choose how many lives you want, but you can choose whatever you want because you will find so many extra continues that you will never run out of continues. And the Sega Genesis just have unlimited continues, so that way you can try and try and try. As I said before, the Sega Genesis is just like the arcade. It borrows the same levels and the same mechanics, so you actually shoot in 4 ways. In Super Ghouls'n Ghosts, you drop the way to shoot 4 ways, but you add a double jump. Talking about jumps, in both games, once you jump is a commitment. Just like in Castlevania, there's no mid-air control once you jump, and you will die many times because of a bad jump. The problem is that in the Super Nintendo version, this becomes even worse, because now we have a second jump that is a commitment as well. The good news is that you can redirect your jump in 3 ways, but once you select one, it's a commitment, and you have to master the double jump if you want to make it part in this game. Both games have different weapons you can choose from. Most of them have their uses to make the game easier. Don't believe the hype that the knife is the end-all be-all of weapons. Yes, it's the most rounded one and it's the fastest one, but for instance in the last level for the Super Nintendo, it's made much more easier with the bow. Especially if you have the armor upgraded to shoot homing projectiles, it makes the fucking Red Devils much easier. I hate you. If not, each battle is just an epic showdown that you most likely will lose. Now that I mentioned the armors, in the Sega one you can only upgrade once, giving you the power to charge an attack. Each weapon does something different. I didn't find them very useful though. In the Super Nintendo you can upgrade twice, once for an upgraded weapon and a second to charge. And again, this is different depending on which weapon you have equipped. In either case though, it does not grant you any extra hits. You just hit once and then twice and you die. And those magicians that pop out when you shoot a chest, in Nintendo they convert you into a baby, which is very funny, but in Sega they convert you in either a doc or an old man. At least when you are an old man you can still fight, so I like that better.
Take that, Sonny!
The bosses are a joke, especially when you compare it to the rest of the game. But I found that Ghouls'n Ghosts for Sega, they were a little more interesting to fight. In some cases they make you use your mechanics. Like in this boss here, you have to be shooting down in order to defeat him. The Super Nintendo ones are much more straightforward, with a few exceptions. The last level in both games is a fucking test your patience and an exercise on frustration. This is because there's just no checkpoints. At least on Sega you get one when you get to the final boss, but in Super Nintendo it's just cruel. You can be in the last second of the game, but if you die, it's back to the beginning of the level. And if you don't have a bow, I guarantee that you will lose your patience and you will have a sore thumb. Look at mine. And that's also to do with the controller. I find that the Sega Genesis controller is much better for this type of arcadey, twitchy kind of games. The D-pad is not as edgy and harsh as the Super Nintendo one, and the buttons feel much better, especially when you use only 2 of them, because the third one is a little harder to reach. So, because of the controller, better bosses, better mechanics, and a smoother gameplay, Sega gets a win on gameplay. Both games are tied in points, but if I had to choose one, it would be... Ghouls'n for the Sega Genesis. Gameplay is a little better for me, and I just love how smooth it is compared to Super Ghouls'n Ghosts. But at the end of the day, these games are just not my cup of tea. Let me explain why. We all know that once you beat the game, you gotta go through it again, with a slight bump in difficulty, and you gotta find a special weapon to really get the true ending. But I found this really weak. I'm playing the same game again, and honestly, I did not go through it again, because when I passed the first run, at the end, instead of saying, "Fuck yeah!" I said, "Finally!" And that's just not a good sign. For me, I want a game that rewards me for mastering its mechanics. But in these games, although you do of course get better and find ways to understand patterns of the enemies, there are just too many random patterns that no matter how good you are, you still die to a random appearance of a zombie or a ghost that you just could not predict. And this to me is just not fun. For example, in Punch-Out, if you don't know the patterns, the opponent will kick your ass. But when you do, you kick his ass. You are rewarded by taking your time and understanding the game. Here, I just did not feel the same kind of reward. You can argue that the randomness of the game gives it more replayability, but as I said, once I went through the first run, I really didn't want it to continue. That may be just me, but sadly to say, these games are just not for me.
Or you can be just a fucking masochist.
So, thanks for watching Okado's Retro Reviews. Happy Halloween, and hasta la próxima.